Hello again. Thank you very, very much for that. It is such an important conversation to have, and as an LGBT plus disabled person myself, it is definitely it's very hard hitting seeing what's happening to the community during this time, and I really appreciate you bringing up this conversation. More people need to hear about this.
Thanks. So, well, I think one of the things that, of course, I can't get in is all of the other impacts on the community. And I really wanted to kind of highlight the fact that for young people in particular who are, closeted at home, I think life is also very, very difficult, for everybody without the scene that we depend on, so I think there's many other ways too that LGBTQI plus people are suffering in the pandemic and suffering very disproportionately. But this was, like I say, specifically about disability.
Absolutely. And it's definitely really important to consider these perspectives, especially when it comes to including, we always hear the narratives about people in social care not being able to receive visitors. And then there's those who are LGBT plus and disabled, and as you mentioned, aren't able to have visitors at all because their family have just cut them off. It is such an important conversation to be had, and I think people in the wider LGBT plus community and even beyond there, they need to know these stories and actually fight with us to try and get what equal rights, if that makes sense.
It does. In 2019, I think it was the Women and Equalities Parliamentary Committee. I'm not very up on them myself, held an inquiry into LGBT plus health and social care, and I was an oral witness, but it just seemed to get swept away. I think very soon after the women's minister was changed, then COVID came along, and none of that seems to have fed in. But of course, nothing has fed into the government's response. They haven't involved any disabled people's organisations, older people's organisations, patients' organisations, BAME organisations. They just haven't involved anybody.
I'm going to start working through the Q&A, if that's okay with you. Great. So the first question I have here for you is, would you be happy to comment on the usefulness or otherwise of the recent newspaper coverage of how COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting disabled LGBTQ plus people?
Well, I haven't seen any. Let's just put it like that. So I can't comment because it doesn't seem to me to have actually been present, but please let me know if that's different.
Thank you. So the next question we have, they firstly commented on your poem. They said it was amazing and they were wiping away tears. And honestly, I was the same. It was very emotional. And they would like to ask, are there any other countries who are getting this right in terms of care under COVID?
Well, I think the reality is that the way you get it right is by having low COVID strategies. So yeah, absolutely. I wish I was in Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, the list goes on. So yeah, I mean, it's all about keeping COVID low. But I mean, obviously as well, you've got all of the systems around lack of PPE. I mean, according to the government, I've already been offered a vaccine, but in reality, I only got a phone call yesterday. But now I'm having to refuse to allow people to come in to vaccinate us wearing a level of PPE that isn't even legal on public transport in France. Under any sort of risk assessment, it's complete madness to have somebody who's been into contact with over 100 other households coming into your home in a paper mask and bare hands, but that's the protocol. So I think quite a few countries are probably doing slightly better than that.
Thank you. And the third question we have here, do you think lockdown has had any positives in terms of increased empathy or more working from home, flexibility and the like?
I don't think it's had any increase in empathy. And, the sad reality is there's an awful lot of kind of very abusive discourse around, well, it's, if it wasn't for old people and disabled people, everybody could be back to normal. And of course, I mean, I'm not going to go into why, but actually that's completely untrue. But it's very convenient for the government to claim that it's to protect us. Could you just say the question again, please?
Yep, absolutely. So the full one was, do you think lockdown has had any positives in terms of increased empathy or more working from home flexibility and like?
I haven't been able to leave the house without support for the last 20 years following a discrimination incident. And again, I think although that's not my underlying impairment, you know, there are a substantial number of disabled people, you know, for whom, yeah, it's been very much at the sharp end of homophobia and transphobia in how they've developed impairments. But yes, I mean, I can't speak without being able to see a face as a result of this particular instance 20 years ago. Now, everybody used to tell me it was impossible to make video calls, but surprise, surprise, it simply isn't. And you know, I'm able to sort of think about doing jobs perhaps that I wouldn't have thought about doing. But yes, certainly the working from home and just the huge range of things that are possible. You know, I work in the arts, and I really hope that what's going to happen is that in future we have blended delivery, so that all of us who can't get to the theatre for whatever reason, and that could be caring responsibilities, childcare, public transport isn't safe, it's not safe to be out to go to an LGBTQI plus production. You know, I really hope that that sort of sense of streaming absolutely continues. I don't think I'll ever have such a good year for home cinema. You know, we're used to having to wait a very, very long time to see films, and all of a sudden they're kind of coming straight onto the TV. But so, yeah, I think culturally and socially, but what we do find, as I touched on, is that anybody who needs substantial support, and I'm sure this is true of any young people with nosy parents, or simply, you know, you don't have a space of your own, it's actually very difficult digitally to be out if other people can spy on you when it's not safe to be out at home in the first place.
Thank you very much. And another question that we've just had in is, do you have advice on how we best fight this? What best action can allies take to support? And do we need to lobby?
I think absolutely we do need to lobby. We've had, you know, we have put forward submissions to, for example, the COVID Parliamentary Committee, and then it's just been completely lost. So I think it is about having the, you know, being aware, having these conversations. The first place we need to start lobbying is the organisation that has the vast majority of funding, of course, which is Stonewall. But I haven't really seen Age UK specifically looking at LGBTQI plus issues, for example. So, yeah, I think it's about people of all ages having those conversations. And like I say, bearing in mind that there are people in their late teens and early 20s in care homes. And of course, a lot of residential care facilities anyway. There's a lot of young people, you know, particularly with learning difficulties, locked up in residential care facilities, where even on a sort of normal day, if we can remember what those looked like, it can be very, very difficult to be out, you know. So for example, we've had people, or in fact we've had social care workers in touch saying so and so isn't allowed to dress the way he wants to dress unless he stays in his own room, and I've been disciplined for allowing him out of his room dressed in drag. You know, that's the sort of level, you know, and yet people are paying for those so-called services that's supposed to be their own home. So there's a lot of issues around social care that impact on people of all ages. And I think that's the other thing. All of the conversation's been about older people. And in the same way that younger people who desperately need the vaccine still haven't got it, you know, there's a lot of younger people in social care.
Thank you. Another question we've just had in, why do you think Stonewall are so silent on this issue? It seems like they should be shouting about it.
Well, it's a really interesting question, because what we find as regard, and again, you know, I could obviously talk for hours, the community is not inclusive, and I spent many years wondering why they were so hostile. And I can only conclude it's because we spent so many decades, if not centuries, saying being gay is not a disease. And there's a real dis-ease, if you like, with any kind of attempt to link being LGBTQI plus with being disabled. And in fact, there is a direct link, you know, which is homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, you know, discrimination, you know, is an absolute link. But people just don't like it. You know, they really, really don't. And that level of hostility kind of, it doesn't matter whether it's clubs that are very, very not keen to let you in if you're obviously disabled, or you're signing yeah, to organisations that hold fundraisers and events in inaccessible places. I mean, I took up with the Arts Council, again, I think this was 2019, where they said to me, oh, it's absolutely wonderful, you know, we funded this whole thing for LGBTQI plus people of Scala. Now, Scala actually means steps. You can't even get in through the front door to the Scala with going up steps. They have no lifts and no accessible toilets. And I had to say, well, what about disabled LGBTQI plus people of colour? Oh, well, you know, do they exist? And it's that kind of box approach as well. You know, well, we'll do something for LGBTQI plus people, but we won't include disabled people, because again, you've also got that stereotype, well, we're asexual, we're genderless, you know, the idea that, you know, you have to be having sex. You know, you can have a very strong identity as a lesbian or a gay man and be a virgin, but because it's so linked with sexual activity, disabled people can't be sexual, so we can't be gay. I've just been joined by a tabby cat for anybody who's relying on audio description. I mean, I'm really hoping, as I think this is a younger audience, the younger people are prepared to have the conversations that I'm just tried for years to get older people to have in vain.
Thank you. And yes, it looks like definitely the younger generations are definitely starting to talk a bit more about disability, especially with recent things that have been coming out in the media. And let's hope that we can get this to broaden to disabled and LGBT plus lives as well, because when it becomes intersectional, it's very different and it's equally as important. Has anybody else, before we move on, got any other questions that you'd like to ask Ju? We've just had another one. Are there differences between those with physical or learning disabilities?
I think there's a lot of difference between disabled people of all impairment groups, but that's like the LGBTQI plus community, isn't it? You know, we're one big glorious rainbow umbrella, and it's very much about, you know, what we talk about is the social model of disability, which is, it's very much about social, attitudinal and environmental barriers, and we're disabled by society. So in that sense, we have absolute solidarity with people with learning difficulties, deaf people, blind people, you know, but all of those communities are different as well. But what we do find to know, the discrimination is very, very similar. I mean, I'm sure it's worse. You know, if you look at participation in cultural activities, people with sensory impairments, you know, blind and deaf people are more excluded from cultural activities than any other group. But we all use the same systems and we face the same discrimination. So it's that same kind of umbrella approach, really.
Yeah, definitely. And if you don't mind me chipping in, I hear a lot from the autistic community that especially a lot of autistic trans people tend to get their identity very brushed off as like an autistic trait, when it's their identity and shouldn't be brushed off. So
absolutely, it makes me really angry the way people. Oh, well, then they haven't got. They're not trans. I mean, well, let's not even dignify some of the things that have recently been said. I think there's also people who are undoubtedly neurodiverse, but very much have been misdiagnosed. You know, I think people look at the way trans teenagers present and can misdiagnose it and label them with all sorts of other labels. You know, I think if you're neurodiverse, you're less likely to kind of, well, be so bothered by social norms. You're more likely to be true to yourself. But the idea that being trans is some kind of symptom of impairment, I just find so offensive that, oh, don't get me started.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you there. It's so frustrating. So I think that's all of the questions. Oh, just had another one. So the question we've just had, how would you recommend an organisation approaches staff to find out if there are LGBTQI plus disabled people? And what do you think would be a good starting point for support?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and probably where I would, because we're not anti-Stonewall per se, although sometimes it can feel like it, but I would start with the Stonewall employment. Sorry, I completely forgot the name of it, but they have a whole scheme with employment champions and very kind of thought out policies. So I think anything I could say off the cuff wouldn't be as good as going to the kind of employment section of the Stonewall website and having a look at it. But don't assume that it covers everything. Again, I think in 2019, I spoke at their employment conference, and it was the very first time they'd had a disability session. So it's not fully inclusive, but I think in terms of LGBTQI plus, so I work part-time leading an organisation called Together 2012, which is together2012.org.uk, and we have a resources section with a thing called What is Disability, and that's got quite a lot of information about what we would call the different theoretical models of disability and disability language, and some stuff about intersectionality. So there are resources there as well. But thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me and listening. I lived in Norwich for 4 years. My grandmother's family come from Norfolk. I wish I could be with you now. Ancient House just looks fascinating.
We'd definitely love to have you down someday when it's significantly safer to do so. Thank you so much for coming and bringing this very, very important discussion to us. And yeah, stay safe, and I hope you are able to take care and return to a safer life as soon as possible.
Well, and all of you, I mean, I think really we've, like I say, we are the lucky ones. We've stayed safe, we're indoors, we're not having to take the risks that I think so many of you. And yes, I mean, I think ultimately we still feel, in comparison to many of our neighbours, we're the lucky ones. So all of you, take care. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of what I can see is just a great conference.
Thank you. And Melissa has posted one of the Stonewall links in the chat if anybody is looking to, if anyone is interested and wanting to find out about that side of things. And the website is regards.co.uk, if I remember rightly, if you are interested in finding out more. So
it's regard.org.uk.
Regards.org.uk if you are interested in finding out more about that organisation.
Lovely. Thank you.